Unveiling the mystery of the Bible's oldest gods. Number 1. Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth, also known as Astarte, was a prominent goddess in the Old Testament. She was intricately linked to themes of fertility and maternity. The worship of Ashtoreth was particularly popular in the city of Sidon, where devotees venerated her with great fervor. Ashtoreth was often seen as a companion or consort of the god Baal and played a significant role in the religious beliefs of ancient Canaan. One significant biblical story highlights the relationship between King Solomon and the worship of Ashtoreth. Under the influence of his foreign wives, Solomon gave in to the temptation of Ashtoreth worship, which ultimately led to his downfall. The story serves as a warning, demonstrating the potential repercussions of deviating from the worship of Yahweh alone and surrendering to the seductions of foreign gods. Ashtoreth was considered a goddess of fertility and motherhood, and her sphere of influence extended not only to the spiritual aspect, but also to the societal and familial aspects of Canaanite culture. She was believed to be worshipped in ancient Syria, Phoenicia, and Canaan. She was worshipped by the Phoenicians as Astarte, the Assyrians as Ishtar, and the Philistines as Asherah. As soon as Joshua died, Asherah worship plagued Israel due to Israel's incomplete conquest of Canaan. Israel was in a state of compromise in Judges chapter 1. Initially, they had fought the pagan culture of the Canaanites. Then they feared it, and then they coexisted with it peacefully. Some might say that this was only a little disobedience compared to everything God had commanded. Still, God does not consider minor disobedience regarding His precise commands. God commanded His people for their good, and He wanted complete obedience. What would motivate them to compromise and disobey God's clear commands? Judges chapter 2 discusses Asherah. The first 5 verses of Judges chapter 2 reveal the Lord lovingly confronting His people about their compromise. Asherah was characterized by a limbless tree trunk planted in the ground. The trunk was typically carved into a symbolic representation of the goddess. As a result of the connection with carved trees, the places of Asherah worship were commonly called groves. He placed the carved Asherah pole he had made in the temple among King Manasseh's evil acts. Consider the moon goddess. Asherah was often presented as a consort of Baal, the sun god. Asherah was also worshipped as the goddess of love and war, and was sometimes linked with Anath, another Canaanite goddess. The cult of Asherah was notorious for its sensuality and involved ritual prostitution. In addition to this, divination and telling fortunes were also practices that the priests and priestesses of Asherah carried out. In the Old Testament, the word Asherah is mentioned 40 times, with 33 of these occurrences referring to the sacred Asherah poles used in pagan and heretical Israelite worship. There are only 7 occurrences of the name Asherah that refer to the goddess herself. A detailed description of Asherah or an Asherah pole is not provided in the Old Testament, nor is the origin of Asherah worship described. In Canaan, sacred sites and altars were adorned with Asherah poles. From Israel's inception, God commanded His people not to worship idols or any other false gods. Intermarrying with pagan nations and practicing pagan worship were forbidden for the Hebrews. God warned Israel not to worship Canaan's gods before they entered the Promised Land. The Jewish law explicitly forbade reverence of Asherah. Judges chapter 6 verse 26 depicts the collapse of an Asherah pole by using it to fuel the fire of a sacrificial offering to the Lord. When Asa reigned in Judah, the Lord had given the Jews the command to demolish and remove all of the high places and sacred sites across the territory. But Israel disobeyed God and continued to worship idols, even introducing the cult of Asherah into the temple in Jerusalem. Ahab transferred 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah into Israel so that people could worship the pagan gods that belonged to his wife Jezebel. A famous Asherah pole stood in Samaria in the days of King Jehoaz. Manasseh, king of Judah, heeded the despicable practices of the pagan nations. He reconstructed the high places and set up altars for Baal and an Asherah pole. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and even made a carved image of Asherah and set it up in the temple. 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 7. He made a carved image of the goddess Asherah and set it up in the house temple, of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, in the tribe of Judah, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." During the reign of Josiah, the high priest Hilkiah cleansed the temple of all images depicting the goddess Asherah. One reason Israel fell to the Assyrians was God's anger over their worship of Asherah and Baal. Despite God's clear instructions, Asherah worship was a perennial problem in Israel. As Solomon slipped into idolatry, one of the pagan deities he brought into the kingdom was Asherah, called the goddess of the Sidonians. At times, Israel experienced a revival, and King Josiah led notable crusades against Asherah worship. Number 2. Baal. Baal, also known as Bel, was a highly revered deity among the Canaanite pantheon. He was often considered a sun god or storm god and played a central role in their mythology. Baal was believed to be a fertility deity who offered bountiful crops to the people and ensured fertility among women. The worship of Baal took various forms, reflecting the multifaceted nature of his perceived powers. The worship of Baal involved controversial rituals that included cult prostitution and sometimes even human sacrifice. These rites were performed in order to invoke Baal's favor for the prosperity of the people and the land. The temptation of Baal worship posed a recurring challenge for the Israelites, as seen in the book of Judges, where they struggled persistently to avoid turning away from the worship of the one true God, Yahweh. In the Bible, there is a famous story about a confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the prophet of Baal. It took place at Mount Carmel. This story serves as a reminder of the ongoing conflict between the worship of the true God and the temptation to follow false gods. Yahweh's divine intervention ultimately confirmed his supremacy. While different regions may have had their own local variations of Baal, all forms of worship dedicated to this false god incurred the wrath of God the Father. The biblical accounts underscore the consequences of Israel's unfaithfulness, as divine punishment befell the people for straying from the exclusive worship of Yahweh. Number 3. Chemosh. Chemosh, who is known as the Subduer, occupied a position of great importance as the national deity of the Moabites and was also revered by the Ammonites. The religious customs linked with Chemosh reveal that some rituals were considered barbaric and might have included acts of human sacrifice. This aspect of worship corresponds with the disturbing pattern found in some ancient religious practices. In 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 13, it is mentioned that King Solomon built an altar to worship Chemosh, a foreign deity, south of Mount of Olives. The altar was built on the Hill of Corruption, which is located outside Jerusalem. This event highlights the difficulties faced by the Israelite kings in remaining loyal to Yahweh, the one true God, while confronting the influence of foreign gods. Chemosh was the deity worshipped by the Moabites, as mentioned in Numbers chapter 21, verse 29, and Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 7, verse 13, and verse 46. In the Bible, Chemosh is referred to as the abomination of Moab, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7. Unfortunately, King Solomon introduced the worship of Chemosh into Israelite culture, as he had wives from other cultures who led him astray to follow other gods. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 4 through 7. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not completely devoted to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the horror, detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil things in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as his father David had done. Then Solomon built a high place for worshiping Chemosh, the horror, detestable idol of Moab, on the hill which is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the horror, detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Chemosh was one of those gods worshipped by Solomon's wives. The cult of Chemosh was eventually destroyed in Judah by King Josiah. 2 Kings chapter 23. The name Chemosh has an uncertain meaning, but some scholars believe it might have referred to a destroyer or subduer. Additionally, Chemosh was also recognized as a fish god. He was the national deity of the Moabites and the Ammonites, according to the Moabite stone, also known as the Mesha Stele. Chemosh was associated with the goddess Ashtaroth, who was another false god, worshipped by wayward Israelites. Chemosh is believed to have been a deity similar to Baal, and there is evidence from both the Moabite stone and scripture that suggests Chemosh might have been the same deity as the Ammonite Moloch. Number 4. Marduk. Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, ruled over domains associated with fertility and vegetation. However, comprehending Mesopotamian deities can be perplexing due to Marduk's identity, which consists of a staggering 50 names, including the title BAAL. It is noteworthy that Marduk's influence extended beyond Babylon, finding reverence among the Assyrians and Persians as well. The various titles and representations of Marduk underscore the rich tapestry of ancient Babylonian religious beliefs and the challenges in disentangling the intricacies of their pantheon. Marduk was a deity that was worshipped as the main god in Babylonian religion. He had many titles, including Bel, which means Lord. He was regarded as the god of storms and fertility, similar to the Canaanite god Baal. The name Marduk is mentioned explicitly only once in Scripture, in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 2. Declare among the nations, lift up a signal to spread the news, publish and proclaim it. Do not conceal it. Say, Babylon has been taken. Bel, the patron god, has been shamed. Marduk Bel has been shattered. Babylon's images have been shamed. Her worthless idols have been thrown down. In this passage, Jeremiah predicts that when God brought judgment upon Babylon, the false god would be exposed and humiliated. The destruction of Babylon would demonstrate that the nation's deities were false and useless gods. The title of Marduk, which is Bel, is mentioned in both Isaiah chapter 46 verse 1 and Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 44. The Babylonian religion worshipped many gods instead of just one. At first, Marduk was only considered a local city god and not a national deity. However, this changed over time with the creation of the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation myth. This myth helped promote Marduk to national deity status. According to the Enuma Elish, Marduk is depicted as the hero who defeats the goddess Tiamat, the primeval saltwater ocean, and creates heaven and earth out of her dead body. The myth also narrates how Marduk killed Tiamat's son, consort, and used his blood to create mankind to serve as the laborers of the gods. It is evident that the Enuma Elish creation story is vastly different from the truth of the Lord's creation in Genesis chapters 1 through 2. The Persian king Cyrus is known for issuing the decree that allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem. As mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 verses 22 through 23, he attributed his decision to Marduk, stating that Marduk, the great Lord, established as his fate for me a magnanimous heart of one who loves Babylon, and I daily attended to his worship. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there in Babylon to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. Marduk, a god worshipped in ancient Babylon, was often depicted in mosaics standing with a dragon. The Ishtar Gate in Babylon had a striding dragon known as Mushushu, which was associated with Marduk. It is interesting to note that Marduk was connected to a serpent-like creature, considering that the devil is often referred to as a serpent in the Bible. Genesis chapter 3 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 3 verses 14 through 15. Revelation chapter 12 verse 9. Moreover, it is known that demons were the primary focus of idol worship in ancient Babylon. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 16 through 17. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods by denying him the honor and loyalty that is rightfully and uniquely his. And with repulsive acts they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, not to God, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately. whom your fathers never feared. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20. On the contrary, the things which the Gentiles, pagans, sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons in effect and not to God. And I do not want you to become partners with demons by eating at feasts in pagan temples. Jeremiah and Isaiah were correct in their condemnation of Marduk. The Lord did bring judgment on Babylon, provoking Marduk and all the other Babylonian gods to be false. There is only one true God, and He is the only one worthy of our worship. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 5. Number 5. Milcom. Milcom was the national deity of the Ammonites and was often associated with divination, which is the practice of seeking knowledge of the future through occult means. The Bible condemns divination as a forbidden aspect of worship. What made matters worse was that Milcom was sometimes linked to the disturbing practice of child sacrifice. Notably, Solomon, in the later years of his reign, succumbed to the temptation of worshiping Milcom alongside other false gods. Variations of the god's name, such as Moloch, Molech, and Molech, highlight the diverse ways in which this false deity was perceived and venerated. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 33. Because they have abandoned me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways and followed my commandments, doing what is right in my sight and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, as did his father David. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 13. The king desecrated the high places which were opposite east of Jerusalem, which were on the right south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the repulsiveness of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the repulsiveness of Moab, and for Milcom, the repulsiveness of the sons, descendants of Ammon. King Joshua conducted a holy convocation at the temple and read the words of the book of the covenant to all the people who were present. He stood by the pillar and made a covenant to obey all the words of the law. The people also joined him in the covenant with the Lord. King Josiah destroyed the idolatrous altars that were erected by Ahaz and Manasseh. Although Manasseh had removed these altars after his conversion, they were again used for idolatrous purposes by Ammon. King Josiah made sure that these altars would never be used again. He desecrated the high places on the southern end of Mount of Olives, Mount of Corruption, which date back to the time of Solomon. He destroyed the altar that was at Bethel and burned the high place. Josiah was chosen before birth to fulfill a prophecy against an altar in Bethel. Number 6. Golden calves. The concept of golden calves makes two appearances in the Bible. Firstly, at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Aaron fashioned a golden calf, and secondly, during the reign of King Jeroboam, as described in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 through 30. After the Israelites had fled Egypt, Moses was on the mountain for a long time, receiving instructions from the Lord. 40 days and 40 nights. That was apparently too long for the Israelites. They were tired of waiting and were impatient. They despised the one whom God used to deliver them from slavery. This Moses, we don't know what happened to him. They also demanded that Aaron create an idol to lead them in Moses's and the Lord's place, a rejection of the first two commandments and a repudiation of their vow to obey the Lord. Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 4. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself any idol, or any likeness, form, manifestation, of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth, as an object to worship. Exodus chapter 32, verses 2 through 4. So Aaron replied to them, Take off the gold rings that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with an engraving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Tragically, Aaron listened to them and told them to bring him gold, which he fashioned into the image of a calf. Chapter 32, verse 4. This is an important choice because the Egyptians and Canaanites, the original inhabitants of the land promised to Israel, were known for their deities shaped like calves. As a result, Israel scorned the great I Am who had rescued them, and instead worshipped the false god of the nations. The praise that was due to God alone was bestowed upon a gold statue. Exodus chapter 32 verses 5 through 6. Now when Aaron saw the molten calf, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So they got up early the next day and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. Then the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to play, shamefully, without moral restraint. Aaron declared that they would hold the festival to the Lord, and the people brought burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Don't forget that they referred to this idol as the Lord, while performing sacrifices as prescribed by the true Lord. Religious synthesis always leads to false religion. When idolatry is mixed with Christianity, Christianity is no longer the same. People sat down to eat and drink before getting up to party. They were clearly not having a harmless celebration. Its foundation was rejected of the true God, and the party most likely incorporated corrupt cultic practices from other nations, such as drunkenness and immorality. Paul quotes this verse when he warns the Corinthians, "Don't become idolaters." Exodus chapter 32 verses 7 through 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people, whom you brought up from the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and sacrificed to it, and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, they are a stiff-necked, stubborn, rebellious people. Now therefore, let me alone and do not interfere, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. And I will make of you, your descendants, a great nation.'" Moses had been on the mountain for days in God's presence, and was completely unaware of what was going on. God informed Moses that Moses' people, notice he did not say my people, had acted corruptly and had quickly abandoned God in favor of idol worship. The Lord declared that they were a stiff-necked people who would be destroyed. After all, he would be able to turn Moses into a great nation instead. Exodus chapter 32 verses 11 through 14. But Moses appeased and entreated the Lord his God and said, "Lord, why does your anger burn against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent their God brought them out to kill them in the mountains and destroy them from the face of the earth'? Turn away from your burning anger and change your mind about harming your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, your servants to whom you swore an oath by yourself, and said to them, 'I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and all this land of which I have spoken I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he had said he would do to his people. Rather than accepting the idea of being the patriarch of a new nation without the existing Israelites, Moses begged God not to destroy Israel. He appealed not to their merit, but to God's reputation and character. First, Moses said the Egyptians would ridicule God's name and claim that he had brought Israel out only to kill them. Second, he reminded the Lord of his promise to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to raise up a great nation from their offspring. And as a result of Moses' intercession, the Lord relented and didn't totally destroy the Israelites. Nonetheless, he declares that he may choose to relent and refrain from bringing threatened judgment upon a people if they change their ways. In other words, he may relent if the people repent or, as in this case, as a result of intercessory prayer. The Lord interacts with his people. He is relational. Moses did not reveal anything to God that he did not already know. Instead, Moses made an appeal to God based on what he knew about God's glory and his faithfulness to his promises. This implies that when we relate to an aspect of God's character, he is free to change his actions without changing his character at all. That is, he is free to change the way he interacts with his people. God's decision not to destroy Israel did not imply that he had changed his mind about their sin. In reality, While he did not annihilate them, he did hold them accountable for their wrongdoing. As a result, God upheld his reputation, remained faithful to his word, and demonstrated his grace. Moses descended the mountain, carrying the 2 tablets inscribed with God's writing. Joshua, who had accompanied Moses up the mountain, heard the noise in the Israelite camp below and assumed it was the result of an enemy attack. When Moses saw the calf and the people dancing, he became enraged and smashed the tablets as an expression of his disappointment that Israel had so quickly broken the covenant God had made with them. The calf was then burned and ground to powder, and the Israelites were forced to drink their sin. Moses confronted his high priest's brother Aaron. He was supposed to lead Israel to know and obey God, but instead he led them into a serious sin. Rather than admitting his mistake, Aaron simply shifted the blame to the people, as if they forced him to. Then he made this absurd claim: "When I threw the gold into the fire, this calf came out." As a result, he falsely implied that the idol was created supernaturally. Moses recognized that the people were out of control, despite the fact that he had confronted them with their sin. Many remained unrepentant. So he exclaimed, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." When the Levites gathered around him in response, Moses dispatched them to carry out God's judgment on those who continued to practice idolatry and immorality. As a result, 3,000 men were killed within a short period of time. Sin is no joke. It brings death. The next day, Moses reminded the people of their sin and declared that he would intercede with God on their behalf. This is followed by another remarkable example of intercessory prayer in the Bible. Moses confessed the people's sin and pleaded for their forgiveness. If God refused to forgive them, Moses requested that God destroy him instead of them. He was ready to give his life for this ungrateful, sinful people. God promised to hold the people accountable for their own sin in response to Moses' prayer. Though he did not intend to destroy the nation, he did address their sin by inflicting a plague. Even though Moses faithfully prayed and interceded for Israel, God would not allow him to take their sin upon himself and be punished in their place. Moses was himself a sinner, so he could not bear the sin of others. But one day a holy and righteous man would come, the God-man, Jesus Christ. Without sin himself, Jesus would be able to bear and take away the sin of the world. Consequences of the golden calf. What made the Israelites decide on a calf? One could point to the gods of other nations as a possible source of inspiration for this. The Egyptian god Hathor, a bull goddess of joy, celebration, and love, may have had some influence on the shape of this idol. Apis, a calf, another Egyptian deity, could have served as inspiration. One could also point to the chief god of Canaanite literature, El, a bull, or Baal, an ox. Although the inspiration for these idols may have come from other religions, bull, cow, and calf idols appear to be scattered throughout the Old Testament narrative. It's no surprise that the first 2 commandments appeared to be against gods and idols. Yahweh deemed these idols as sinful, as the commandments explicitly forbid the making of any images representing him. The golden calves serve as cautionary examples of deviating from the prescribed worship of the one true God and the consequences that accompany such deviations.